Hello, my name's Nick Park and welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. Over the next few weeks, we're running a series of 5-minute lessons on the kings of Israel. We're calling it Biblical Game of Thrones. We're looking at the shenanigans that went on behind the thrones of Judah and Israel, and yet how the purposes of God overruled all the politics. Now, the first king of Israel, of course, was King Saul. And Saul was Israel's first king because Israel demanded a king. They basically said, look, all the other nations around us have got kings, so we should have a king as well. Which, when you stop to think about it, was incredibly stupid, because God had called Israel to be different from the nations around them. I mean, the whole reason that they were possessing the promised land was because they weren't like the surrounding Canaanite nations, and yet now they wanted to be like them. And so they wanted a king. And you know what? Sometimes God allows you to get what you're asking for, even when you'd be better off without it. And that's what happened on this occasion. So they got their king. And they picked Saul. You know what? Saul looked the part to be a king. He was good looking and he was tall. And you'd be amazed how often those characteristics are part of what gets people elected. In the United States, for example, in the last 19 US elections, going all the way back to the Second World War, out of those 19 elections, there's only been 5 times whenever the shorter of the two candidates managed to win the presidential election. That was Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush twice, and Joe Biden. On all the other occasions, on the other 14 occasions, the taller man won, because amazingly that makes a difference to people. It's not their ability to run the country, it's do they look the part. And so Saul looked the part. But you know what? He started well. He started in humility. At the beginning, he actually tried to hide among all the baggage because he didn't want to be made king because of his humility. But they found him and they made him king. Now, if only Saul had continued the way he started, his kingship would have been a wonderful story for Israel. But sadly, he fell into disobedience. And there were 2 key areas where Saul disobeyed God. The first one was in 1 Samuel chapter 13, when he was supposed to wait for the prophet Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice. And Saul got fed up of waiting, so he offered the sacrifice instead, and he tried to justify it. And then later on in 1 Samuel chapter 15, Saul was told that he had to destroy the Amalekites completely, and he didn't. He held back the king, he held back sheep and everything else in order to, he wanted to reward his followers by giving them a few presents, and it was customary among the surrounding nations to have a victory parade with the defeated king coming along behind, and that enhanced a leader's prestige. And so Saul went out to Samuel and said, I've obeyed God, I've done everything I'm told. And next thing there's a bah. And Samuel said, well, what's this sound of bleating of sheep that I can hear? You have not obeyed God. Now, after Saul's disobedience, he descended into paranoia because God was raising up David to be king. And Saul became insanely jealous of David, trying to kill him and really just surrounding himself with an atmosphere of fear and insecurity. And finally, Saul's kingship ended up in disgrace, witchcraft and suicide. It ended up with him consulting a witch to try to find what the result of a battle would be, and he ended up killing himself on the battlefield. But you know, one of the areas where Saul really went wrong in his disobedience was seeking the applause of men, because he was afraid that the army was going to melt away if Samuel didn't arrive to do the sacrifice. So he said, I've got to do this to keep the people on my side. And also the whole thing with not destroying everything of the Amalekites was, again, he wanted to reward people. He was a people pleaser. And in the end, You know, we can't always please people. Our heart has got to be to please God. Saul forgot that fundamental lesson of leadership, and it ended up destroying his kingship. And so God had to raise up other kings instead. May we learn from that lesson today that our motivation must be to please God, not to please men. May God bless you today, and join us again next time for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.